Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. Just hot off the press, US President Donald Trump says he doesn't think a proposed investment deal to secure access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals is dead.
That seems to be a shift from what the administration had been telegraphing over the weekend, which saw Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told to leave without the deal being signed. This after a heated argument between Zelensky, Trump, and US Vice-President JD Vance in front of the media in the Oval Office. But after what some have described a fractious meeting with Trump just days ago, the Ukrainian president has said he is still ready to sign a U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal.
So while the framework leaves many details to be worked out if signed, this is the first agreement of its kind. But where exactly does Ukraine belong on the U.S. agenda? For more insights, we're joined by Dr. Lincoln Mitchell, professor from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Welcome to the show, Professor. Good evening to you over New York.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. If I may just briefly weigh on this Borscht issue, because I know this is important.
Yes.
Borscht is indeed, originally Ukrainian. Many things that we think of as Russian culture originated in Ukraine. Onion-shaped doughs, borscht, matryoshka dolls. It is served hot in the winter and cold in the summer. It is also in the United States. It's a common food or traditional food for Ashkenazi Jews. So my family, we grew up eating borscht because we're Ashkenazi Jews coming from that part of the world. It's delicious in the summer with a boiled potato. You'll love it.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you for that history lesson, sir.
Always learning new things from you,
pleasure.
Professor. Yes, and great to have you on as always. So first off, let's touch on that heated exchange we've seen between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. What do you make of that interaction that we all saw a few days ago? And do you think that the deal is still in the cards coming from Trump's perspective?
The deal is probably still in the cards. What I make of that is that Zelensky had not fully processed that the Americans had changed sides, right? What you saw was J.D. Vance essentially repeating Vladimir Putin's talking points. And then Donald Trump has this tantrum where he's repeating Putin's talking points. And there's no way Zelensky could have been prepared for that. It was just so extreme. I think he handled himself as well as possible under the circumstances. Getting out of that room as quickly as possible was probably a smart move. But I think Trump wants this mineral deal. You know, he sees money there, which is not how we've traditionally thought of American foreign policy. A more traditional way would say, why don't you give our companies first crack at doing business there rather than just give us the minerals? But, you know, this is the Trump administration. They're not acting in the way that we've gotten used to seeing the United States act over the last 80 years.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, as you rightly pointed out, the Trump administration seems to have changed its stance on the war to a more hawkish one. And we only need to cast our minds back to when the U.S. sided with Russia twice in votes at the UN to mark the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Against that backdrop, how significant is this deal for the future of relations between U.S. and Ukraine? And what might it mean for the broader geopolitical landscape?
Well, one thing we have to consider here is that Zelensky, when he left Washington, went to Europe, where he had a much warmer reception. So one thing that Trump has said, which I think resonates with a lot of American voters, is that if this is important for Europe, Europe should be paying for Ukraine's defense. Europe just may do that. And if that happens, the United States is sidelined. Zelensky doesn't need a mineral deal with the United States if Europe is helping him out. So that is a very, very significant thing. I mean, I can't stress enough, it's not that the United States has become more hawkish. It's that the United States has switched sides. I mean, voting with Russia against Europe and against Ukraine. I mean, if you listen to what J.D. Vance said, he said, Biden talked tough. Biden didn't just talk tough. Biden gave Ukraine enormous amounts of monetary, valuable weapons, which, by the way, were very good for the American economy because we, the United States, were giving Ukraine weapons that were kind of not obsolete, but older, and then replacing them by manufacturing. So it actually ginned up manufacturing here in the United States. And, of course, Zelensky knows that. That's why he has expressed gratitude to the United States over and over and over again. But now it looks like the United States has switched sides. Now, we have not been on the same side as Moscow in a global conflict, really, except for the first Gulf War, since World War II. Right? If you're over 90, you can remember a time when we fought with rather than against Russia. But this is an enormously big deal, especially as it is very clear that Putin is the aggressor here. And, Trump and Vance's refusal to accept that is like refusing to accept that the sun is hot. It's just a basic fact.
Yeah, so speaking of a big deal, Ukraine's deputy prime minister has reportedly described this minerals deal as, quote, part of a bigger picture. So do you think this type of agreement, linking economic resources to security outcomes, could possibly set a precedent for how the U.S. engages with other countries facing similar conflicts?
I mean, unfortunately, yes, right? Biden supported Zelensky and Ukraine, not just the president, but the country, for a couple of reasons. One was, in the case of President Joe Biden, our former president, I think he just believed that Ukraine was right and Russia was wrong, and the United States should be on the side of right. Foreign policy isn't always that simple, but in this case, I think that was driving Joe Biden. Secondly, was the notion that in the bigger picture, an aggressive expansionist Russia is not good for the United States. That's a position we've held for 80 years. That when Russia starts grabbing territory in Europe, it's not good for us in the long run. Trump is saying something different. Trump is saying, hey, if we can just kind of do a smash and grab operation, get some money from these minerals, it doesn't matter who wins this war. So what that puts Ukraine is saying, okay, if we cut this deal, and we give up these minerals, which was never part of the deal before Trump came in, what can you give us? And I think Zelensky wanted an answer to that. Okay, we're going to do this mineral deal, which obviously Ukraine doesn't want to do, but they feel they may have to do it. But then what does Ukraine get? They need some security guarantees. And remember that the aggressor here, there's no reason to think they'll honor a ceasefire. If I was advising President Zelensky, I would say he'll have to get some guarantee from Trump that Russia will honor the ceasefire. And you're not seeing that from the Trump administration. So what does Zelensky get from this deal?
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, you mentioned a good point about security guarantees, and I want to cast your mind back to the trilateral statement which was signed in January 1994, under which Ukraine agreed to transfer the nuclear warheads to Russia for elimination. And in return, Ukraine received security assurances from the U.S., Russia, and Britain. Now, given the terse political climate that we're now seeing between the U.S. and Ukraine, where potential security guarantees aren't assured by the U.S. government, is there a case for Ukraine to not adhere to future agreements and say that, well, the U.S. hasn't upheld their end of the bargain?
Well, this is a big picture question about the United States, and something that I'm discussing with a lot of my colleagues, which is increasingly the rest of the world will see the United States as untrustworthy. Now, a lot of Americans, particularly Americans who are not supporters of the president, are saying, well, they'll understand this is just Trump. It's not Biden, it's not Kamala Harris, or whoever the next Democratic president might be. But the problem is, as long as the threat of Trump or somebody like him coming back exists, and that's likely to exist for some time, the United States can't be trusted. And while we've always had foreign policy disagreements, in the big picture, certainly at the policy-making level, there's been, if not a consensus, an agreement on basic principles. With some good, some bad. I'm not saying the United States is always on the right side at all, right? But that agreement is breaking down. And what we see is Trump not acting as the head of state, which is in fact the part of the president's job, but acting as in his own interest. He wants he and his friends to have an opportunity to get this money. Obviously, Elon Musk has his hand in this as well. And that is something that the rest of the world is going to have to consider. The United States, regardless of what happens with this president, remains the most powerful military in the world. And that's likely to be true for a while, right? Just because of the hardware that we have, if nothing else, the military hardware. And an untrustworthy rogue United States is a massively destabilizing force for every country in the world.
Yeah, so I want to get back to what the rationale is behind, from the perspective of the U.S. government here, because you mentioned, looking at what the agreement entailed, reports suggest that the U.S. dropped its demands for $500 billion in potential mineral revenue from Ukraine. And another point that was surfaced, to your point, there also wasn't any firm security guarantees to war-torn Ukraine. So what's the rationale behind all of this from Trump's perspective?
Well, I think one thing, if you have a chance to review the video, go watch Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, and watch his body language, because you see his face as the United States just goes against everything we've always stood for. And again, the rationale here is that Donald Trump is driven by self-interest and a sense of personal grievance. So there's one point in the meeting where Donald Trump starts talking about the investigation into his dealings with Russia in the 2016 campaign. This has nothing to do with Ukraine, except that we now know, if you recall, the first impeachment of Donald Trump, where the House impeached him and the Senate acquitted, was because of him trying to pressure Zelensky. Before this full-scale invasion even happened, pressure Zelensky to dig up dirt on Joe Biden going into the 2020 election, if you remember that back in 2019. And what this shows is that Ukraine has been the kind of far MAGA wing of the Republican Party has had it in for Ukraine for many years now. And this disinformation bubbling in right-wing circles, Ukraine started this war, these just disinformation about Zelensky and corruption and him stealing money, which isn't true, that has kind of framed how people, particularly with Vance. Vance was put on the ticket as the most anti-Ukraine candidate. Think of how this meeting would look different if Marco Rubio, who was also on the short list for vice president, were the vice president. Because if you watch, it's Vance who's really pushing this. So there's a lot going on here. But the bottom line, if you want like the 3-second takeaway here, is the United States has switched sides in what is, in my view, the biggest and most important conflict in the world right now.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, Ukraine and its European allies have also become increasingly alarmed over the recent thaw in U.S.-Russian ties. What implications does that have for Ukraine, and is there a risk that Ukraine could be sidelined in negotiations against the backdrop of the Trump administration's change of stance on the war?
Well, going back for several years now, people who I speak to on the Russia side have told me that what Putin wants is direct negotiations with the American president, even when it was Biden. Even Biden and Putin certainly didn't see eye to eye. Putin has always wanted that. He wants Russia to be treated like a superpower, Ukraine to be treated like kind of collateral damage, and to negotiate directly with the American president, which obviously raises his stature on the global stage. And, of course, Zelensky has the very rational position of, hey, if you're going to negotiate about my country, we need to have Ukrainian representation at the table. But if a deal is cut without Ukraine at the table, that's that's going to be very frightening for any country in Russia. In Europe. Think of right now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states. None of these countries have more than 5 or 6 million people. These are countries with fewer people than the city, we're both speaking now. New York and Singapore. And we are, by treaty, obligated to defend them if they're invaded by Russia because of NATO. But if we start chopping up Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, every one of those Baltic states is going to realize that as long as Trump is president, we're very, very unlikely to honor that treaty obligation. And that changes the security calculation for every country in Europe, and it empowers Russia at the expense, particularly of these small countries. France and the United Kingdom can defend themselves, but even Poland, which is a big country, can't really defend itself from Russia.
Yeah.
So if the United States removes itself or switches sides, it's a very, very big shakeup for the global order.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, I know we've unpacked so much today, but before we let you go, we're about a month and a half into Trump's second term. How would you assess his foreign policies so far? Will the U.S.'s, traditional allies still be able to count on that alliance without fear of tariffs or other uncertainties as well?
Well, if I were Xi Jinping and I had tasked a subordinate to write a to-do list for the new American president, he would be following that to-do list. So, for example, one thing we haven't talked about is the dismantling of USAID, which is so important for the United States building relationships around the world, for building goodwill towards the United States. There are, I can't tell you how many millions of people in famine conditions have been fed by bags of food from USAID that stay on the side from the American people. Just simple things like canceling that. Threatening or calling for ethnic cleansing in Gaza? What does that do to the U.S. relations in the Muslim world? What does that do to raise the threat of terrorism in Europe and in the United States, by the way, of course? So we are in a much, much more dangerous world. Any longstanding ally of the United States needs to be very, very concerned right now. We have not seen a shift in American policy of the orientation of American policy. Maybe when Roosevelt came in and gradually became more of an internationalist than Hoover. But for the most part, we've never seen anything like this in American history. We are now on the other side. And many Americans are not happy about that. And I'm sure many of our European allies are not happy about that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a very turbulent time for global diplomacy, and it will be interesting, to say the least, to see how all of these relations unfold in the coming months. We've been speaking with Dr. Lincoln Mitchell, professor from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, I can't help but wonder if this conversation has enticed you to order some piping hot borscht for dinner from the nearest diner.
Well, I know how to cook borscht. Well, I might just make some, but I got to get some beets and some potatoes. I'll make a vegetarian one because I don't eat meat. But I'm Jewish. I know how to make borscht.
Yeah, could you please send us some borscht here in Singapore?
Absolutely. But I suspect you made better food there than borscht. But okay, I will.
All right. I look forward to it with bated breath. That was Dr. Lincoln Mitchell, professor from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.